Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. Wherever you are tonight, settled under a blanket, stretched across a quiet room, or listening in that half-lit space between the end of your day and the beginning of sleep, this is a place for calm, unhurried stories. Stories about real people who lived full, complicated, surprising lives. Tonight, we are spending the evening with one of the most recognizable figures in American history. Before we begin, you are welcome to leave a quiet comment below, letting us know where in the world you are listening from tonight. And if there is someone from history you would like to spend a future evening with, you can leave that name too. If these stories help you rest, subscribing is a gentle way to help more people find them. Now, let us settle in. His face appears on the $100 bill. His name is attached to lightning rods, bifocals, electricity, and the founding of a nation. He is one of those figures who has become so familiar, so thoroughly woven into the public imagination, that it can be easy to forget he was a person first. A child in a crowded house, a young man with no clear path, someone who failed and doubted and wandered before he became the name carved into monuments. But here is the thing that has always stayed with me about Benjamin Franklin. He never finished school. He left formal education at the age of 10 years old, and yet he became a scientist who corresponded with the greatest minds of Europe, a writer whose words shaped a new country, a diplomat who charmed the courts of kings. He built himself, slowly, quietly, out of books and curiosity, and an almost bottomless willingness to keep trying. There is something in that story, something about what a life can become when a person simply refuses to stop learning, that feels worth sitting with. He was born on a Sunday morning in January of 1706, Boston, Massachusetts. The city in those days was compact and cold in winter, a place of narrow streets and wooden houses, the smell of salt air drifting in from the harbor. The Puritan tradition was still very much alive. Sundays were serious, the church was central, and the life of a tradesman's family moved to a rhythm of work and faith and careful frugality. Josiah Franklin, Benjamin's father, had come to America from England some years before. He was a candlemaker and soap boiler by trade, work that was steady, if not glamorous, filling the family home with the warm, slightly waxy smell of tallow. Josiah was a thoughtful man, known among his neighbors for good judgment. He often invited guests to his table in the evenings, not wealthy men or powerful ones, but curious ones, craftsmen, ministers, tradespeople, and the conversations around that table ranged far. Benjamin, years later, would credit those dinners with shaping his mind more than any classroom. His mother, Abiah Folger Franklin, was capable and patient. She had to be. Benjamin was the 15th of Josiah's 17 children, the 10th and youngest son. The house was full, loud in the way that only a house with many children can be, crowded in the evenings and early in the mornings. Benjamin grew up knowing how to find quiet in a noisy world. He grew up learning how to listen. He was a capable student from the start, quick with language, easy with numbers. His father sent him to the Boston Latin School when he was 8, with some early hope that Benjamin might become a minister. But the cost of a proper education was beyond what the family could manage for long, and after less than 2 years of formal schooling, Benjamin was taken out of class and put to work in his father's candle shop. He was 10 years old, The minister's path was closed. What would open instead, no one could have said. The candle shop was not where he wanted to be. He hated cutting wicks and filling molds and running errands through the cold Boston streets. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was to be near the sea. He loved the water. He was a strong swimmer for his era, and he spent as much time as he could on the harbour, rowing out with friends, watching the ships move in and out of port. There is a small story from these years that has always seemed to me to capture something essential about him. As a boy, Benjamin organised a group of his friends to steal a pile of stones from a construction site and use them to build a small wharf on the edge of a muddy mill pond where they liked to fish. A practical solution to a practical problem. Planned, executed, social. He was 10, maybe 11. His father found out and was not impressed by the ingenuity. The stones had to be returned, and Benjamin received a lecture on the importance of honesty in all things, even small things. He remembered that lecture. He always said he believed his father was right. The sea was not to be his path either. Josiah worried that a life on the water was too dangerous. One of Benjamin's older brothers had already been lost at sea. So instead, at the age of 12, Benjamin was apprenticed to another older brother, James, who had set up as a printer in Boston. The print shop was a different world from the candle shop. There were books everywhere, paper and ink, the smell of lead type warming on the press. Words. Benjamin stepped into it and did not look back. He worked hard. He set type, operated the press, ran deliveries. But what he did beyond his work hours was more important. He read everything he could find. He borrowed books from booksellers' apprentices and returned them before dawn so they would not be missed. He found a collection of essays, The Spectator, a London periodical from some years earlier, and read it so carefully, so repeatedly, that he began using it as a writing textbook. He would read an essay, set it down, and then try to recreate it from memory, comparing his version to the original to see where he had fallen short. He was teaching himself to write, in the dark, in borrowed time, without a teacher. He was also teaching himself to argue. He found a copy of a book on the Socratic method, a style of reasoning through questions rather than declarations, and he took to it with great enthusiasm, perhaps too much enthusiasm. He practiced it on everyone around him. His friends grew tired of being led through elaborate logical puzzles, only to find they had contradicted themselves. Later in life, Franklin would admit that he had been insufferable in this period, too eager to win, too proud of his ability to corner people in their own words. He moved away from it eventually, toward a gentler, more listening style of conversation, but the habit of thinking carefully, of testing ideas rather than simply accepting them, that never left. The print shop under James Franklin was not always a peaceful place. James was difficult, strict, sometimes harsh, the kind of older brother who did not entirely trust a younger one, who was, it had to be said, probably the more gifted of the two. Benjamin resented the apprenticeship deeply at times. He was legally bound to James until he was 21, and James made sure he felt the weight of that arrangement. But something remarkable happened in the middle of this tension. James began publishing a newspaper. The New England Courant, started in 1721, was one of the first newspapers in the American colonies, and it had an edge to it. willing to criticize authority, willing to stir things up. Benjamin wanted to write for it. He knew James would refuse. So, at 16 years old, he invented someone else. He began writing letters under a false name and slipping them under the print shop door at night. The name he chose was Silence Dogood, a middle-aged widow, practical, witty, a sharp observer of Boston life and manners. Silence Dogood had opinions about fashion, about the treatment of women, about the pomposity of Harvard-educated men who knew Latin but not common sense. James and his friends loved her. They published her letters eagerly, debating among themselves who this mysterious woman might be. She ran for 14 letters before Benjamin finally admitted he was the author. The response from James was not congratulations. It was irritation. He had been made to look foolish, or at least unobservant. The relationship between the brothers grew colder. Not long after, James landed in legal trouble with the colonial authorities over something printed in the Courant and was briefly imprisoned, leaving Benjamin to run the shop. When James returned, the dynamic had shifted, and not comfortably. By 1723, Benjamin had had enough. He was 17. He had no money and no plan, but he boarded a boat out of Boston without permission, breaking the legal terms of his apprenticeship, and sailed south. He was leaving the only city he had ever known, carrying almost nothing, heading somewhere he had never been. Philadelphia. The journey took several days. Rough water part of the way, a stop in New York where there was no work to be found. When he finally arrived in Philadelphia, he came ashore tired, bedraggled, with a Dutch dollar and a copper shilling to his name. He was hungry. He wandered into a bakery and asked what he could get for 3 pennies. He was handed 3 large rolls. He walked through the streets of the city, eating one, a roll tucked under each arm, uncertain where he would sleep that night. A young woman standing in a doorway watched him pass and found the sight amusing. He noticed her noticing him. Her name, though he did not know it yet, was Deborah Reed. She would become his wife. But that was still years away. For now, he was simply a young man in a new city, alone and uncertain, and beneath all of it, quietly alive, with the sense that something had begun. Philadelphia in 1723 was a young city, but it carried itself with a kind of confident energy that Boston, older and more settled in its ways, did not quite have. The streets were wider, laid out in an orderly grid that William Penn had planned decades earlier. There were trees. There were open lots between buildings where the city had not yet filled itself in. It was a place still becoming what it would be, and perhaps that is partly why Benjamin Franklin felt at home there almost immediately. He found work quickly. A printer named Samuel Keimer took him on, recognizing at once that this disheveled young man from Boston knew what he was doing around a press. Franklin was skilled, faster and more careful than most, and Keimer was glad to have him. He found lodgings with a family named Red, the same family whose daughter had watched him walk past with his bread rolls on the morning he arrived. He did not know yet that this was the same house, the same girl. Life has a way of arranging these coincidences so quietly that you only see them later. He settled into a routine, work during the day, reading in the evenings. Philadelphia had a modest but growing community of young tradesmen and merchants, and Franklin began to move among them, curious, sociable, already developing the quality that would serve him his whole life, which was the ability to make almost anyone feel interesting. He listened well. He asked good questions. He was not yet famous, not yet remarkable to the world, but the people around him noticed something in him that was hard to name exactly. The governor of Pennsylvania at the time was a man named William Keith, and through a chain of small events, Keith became aware of the young printer from Boston. He summoned Franklin, flattered him generously, and made him an extraordinary offer. "Go to London," Keith said. "I will give you letters of introduction and the funds to purchase printing equipment. Set yourself up as a printer in Philadelphia with the backing of the governor himself." It was a dazzling prospect for a 17-year-old with 3 pennies to his name just months before. Franklin prepared to go. He said a careful goodbye to Deborah Reed, to whom he had grown close. He boarded a ship in the autumn of 1724 and sailed for England, carrying what he believed were Keith's letters of introduction and financial backing. When he arrived in London and finally opened the packet that was meant to contain those letters, he found that it held nothing useful. The letters were not there. The funds were not arranged. Keith, it turned out, was a man who made promises he never intended to keep. A charming talker who enjoyed the sensation of being generous without the inconvenience of following through. Franklin stood in London with almost nothing. He was 18 years old, in a foreign city, with no patron and no plan. A lesser person might have crumbled. Franklin found a print shop and asked for work. London in those years was enormous, loud, and extraordinary. It was the largest city in the Western world, smoky and crowded, its streets filled with the noise of carts and vendors and the clatter of commerce from early morning until late at night. The Thames ran wide and grey through the centre of it, always busy with boats. Franklin moved through it all with his characteristic openness, taking everything in, learning without quite meaning to. He worked at a well-known printing house called Palmer's, and later at another called Watts's, setting type during the day and exploring the city in whatever time he had left. He swam in the Thames, which impressed his English co-workers greatly. He ate modestly. He drank water rather than the small beer that most printers consumed throughout the workday, which made him something of an oddity in the shop, but which also meant he was sharper and steadier than most of the men around him. He had already begun to develop the habits of deliberate self-management that would define him, not from moral rigidity, but from simple practicality. He wanted to think clearly. He wanted his body to serve his mind. He read constantly. London had bookshops and coffee houses and an intellectual life that Boston could not match, and Franklin absorbed it eagerly. He met thinkers, eccentrics, scientists, writers. He wrote a short philosophical pamphlet during this period, a youthful argument about free will and determinism that he would later disavow as a mistake. He was still forming his ideas, still testing the edges of what he believed. That was perhaps the most important thing London gave him. Not contacts, not money, not credentials, just exposure. The sense of how large the world of ideas actually was, and how much room there was inside it. He stayed in London for nearly 2 years. He might have stayed longer, but a Philadelphia merchant named Thomas Denham offered him something that drew him back. Denham was returning to America and needed a clerk. He offered Franklin a modest salary, the chance to learn the merchant trade, and his friendship Franklin accepted. He sailed back across the Atlantic in 1726, at 20 years old, and he spent those weeks at sea doing what he often did with long, quiet stretches of time. He wrote. He composed a plan for how he wanted to live, a set of personal resolutions covering industry, sincerity, and the careful use of time. The ocean was grey and wide around him, the ship slow and rolling, and somewhere in that crossing, he began to take himself seriously as a person with a direction. Back in Philadelphia, things did not go smoothly at first. Thomas Denham fell ill not long after they returned and died within a year. Franklin found himself once again without a clear path. He returned reluctantly to Keimer's print shop, which was no more comfortable than before. But he was learning, always learning, watching how a business worked and where it failed, storing up observations that he would use when the time came. That time came sooner than expected. In 1728, Franklin and a partner named Hugh Meredith set up their own printing business. Franklin was 22. The shop was modest, a rented space, a second-hand press, paper that had to be bought carefully because money was tight. But Franklin worked with an energy that his competitors could not match. He was at the press early and stayed late. He made sure to be seen working hard, understanding even then that reputation was a kind of currency, and that people noticed whether a man's shop was lit before dawn and after dark. The business grew. He printed government documents, legal forms, pamphlets. He printed a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, which he had purchased from the hapless Keimer, and he turned it into the most widely read paper in the colony through a combination of good writing, careful editing, and a sharp instinct for what his readers wanted to know. He wrote much of it himself, in voices that varied from serious to gently satirical, always calibrated to the moment. He had been practicing this since he was 16, slipping letters under his brother's door in Boston. He was very good at it now. In 1730, he and Deborah Reed were finally together. Their path to each other had been complicated. While Franklin was in London, Deborah had married another man, a potter named Rogers, who had turned out to be unreliable, possibly already married elsewhere, and who had eventually disappeared. The legality of Deborah's situation was uncertain, which made a formal marriage between her and Franklin legally complicated. So they entered what was called a common law arrangement, a committed partnership without a marriage certificate, which carried some risk for Franklin if Rogers ever returned and caused trouble, but which suited the reality of their circumstances. They set up a household together and built a life. Deborah was practical, steady, and devoted. She was not a social creature in the way that Franklin increasingly became, and she never accompanied him on the long years he spent abroad in later life, which was a sadness that neither of them spoke about much in writing. But in these early Philadelphia years, she was essential to what they were building together. She managed the household and helped with the shop. She was competent and organized and loyal in a way that Franklin always acknowledged, even when his attention was pulled in 100 other directions. In 1732, Franklin began publishing Poor Richard's Almanack. It was a practical publication, weather predictions, calendar information, astronomical data. But it was also something more. Poor Richard, the fictional author Franklin invented, was a humble and slightly hapless character whose wife nagged him into publishing the Almanack to earn money, and scattered through the pages, between the tide tables and the planting guides, were sayings. Short, clear, memorably worded pieces of practical wisdom. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. God helps those who help themselves. Many of these phrases were not entirely original. Franklin borrowed liberally from the folk wisdom of several cultures and several centuries. But he refined them, sharpened them, gave them the particular snap and rhythm that made them unforgettable. Poor Richard's Almanack sold enormously well, year after year for 25 years, and made Franklin both prosperous and famous in a way that his printing work alone could not have done. He was becoming, quietly and steadily, one of the most recognized figures in the colonies. But he was also, in these same years, living with a complexity that his public image tended to smooth over. Before his partnership with Deborah was established, perhaps just before or during those uncertain early years of settlement, a son had been born, William Franklin. The mother's identity was never recorded and has never been confirmed. Franklin acknowledged William fully, raised him as his own, and Deborah accepted the child into the household. It was handled, as so many things in Franklin's life were handled, with a kind of quiet pragmatism. But it was there, a human complication beneath the orderly surface of a man building his reputation, one careful brick at a time. There was something he did in these years that almost no one outside of Philadelphia knew about, and that he himself said very little about publicly. He organized his friends. It began modestly, a small group of young tradesmen and artisans meeting on Friday evenings to discuss ideas, philosophy, science, business, morality, the practical questions of how a society ought to work. Franklin called it the Junto. There were 12 of them at the start, a careful number, and the meetings had a structure. Questions were posed at each gathering. Members were expected to have read, to have thought, to have something worth saying. It was a school of sorts, and a community, and a network, though Franklin would not have used that last word, which belongs to a later era. What he understood instinctively was that a group of curious, industrious people who trusted one another could accomplish more than any one of them alone. Out of the Junto came, among other things, the first lending library in America. The members pooled their books, then pooled funds to buy more. The Library Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1731, gave ordinary people access to books they could never have afforded individually. It was a small thing by some measures. By others, it was a profound act, the democratization of knowledge, one borrowed volume at a time. Franklin would later say that the library had been an important factor in the self-education of the American colonists generally, giving ordinary people access to the same ideas that were available to the wealthy. He was proud of it in the quiet way he was proud of things that worked. By his late 20s and early 30s, Franklin had built something real. A business, a family, a reputation, a community. He had done it without inheritance, without formal schooling, without powerful family connections. He had done it through work and reading, and the steady cultivation of relationships grounded in mutual usefulness and genuine warmth. He was, by any measure, a success, and yet the life that history remembers him for had barely started. The printing business, the Almanack, the junto. These were the foundation. But somewhere in the middle of all of it, something else had been quietly growing. A question, a fascination, an itch that the world of commerce and print could not quite scratch. He had always been curious about the natural world, about the way things worked beneath the surface of ordinary experience. And in the 1740s, that curiosity found its focus. He had heard about experiments with electricity. In Europe, scientists had been studying this strange, invisible force. The way glass rods, when rubbed, could attract small objects. The way certain materials, when charged, could produce a visible spark. It was new territory, not yet mapped, not yet understood. When Franklin first encountered a demonstration of electrical phenomena, possibly through a traveling lecturer who passed through Philadelphia, something in him recognized it as the kind of problem worth spending time on. He was in his early 40s. He'd worked hard his whole life and had, by this point, arranged his business affairs well enough to step back from day-to-day management. He had a partner he trusted. He had income. He had time, or something approaching it, and he turned that time, with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, toward the invisible mystery of electricity. The experiments began in his home. Simple equipment at first: glass tubes, metal rods, jars, wire. He designed his own apparatus when he needed something that did not exist. He worked methodically, varying one condition at a time, recording what he observed, forming hypotheses and testing them. He had no formal training in natural philosophy. What he had was patience, precision, and a gift for thinking in clear models, for seeing complex phenomena in terms of simple underlying principles. What he was working toward, though he did not yet know the shape of it, would change how the world understood the sky. The summer days in Philadelphia could be heavy and still, the air thick before a storm, the light turning a particular shade of greenish-grey that anyone who has lived through a thunderstorm in that part of the world will recognize. Franklin watched those storms. He had always watched them. The way the clouds built and darkened. The way the air changed before the lightning came. The way the strike itself was so brief and so total. There and gone before the mind could fully register it. He had a theory. It had been forming for some time, built up from his experiments in the house, from the sparks he had drawn from charged glass and metal, from the careful observations he had recorded in letters to a scientific contact in London named Peter Collinson. The theory was this: that lightning was not a supernatural event, not the anger of heaven or the discharge of some celestial mechanism, but simply electricity. The same force he had been studying in his parlor, operating at an almost incomprehensible scale in the clouds above. It was not an obvious idea. It was not a safe idea, intellectually speaking, because it made a very large and testable claim about the natural world. And Franklin, being Franklin, wanted to test it. The experiment he designed was elegant in its simplicity. A tall, pointed metal rod extended into a storm cloud, connected by a wire to the ground. If lightning was electrical, the rod would draw the charge and conduct it safely downward. He also imagined a version using a kite, a way of reaching the clouds without needing a tall structure. The kite, made of silk to withstand rain, with a metal point at the top and a key tied to the string near the flyer's hand, would rise into the charged air of an approaching storm and, if the theory was correct, The string would conduct electricity down to the key, and the key would spark. The famous kite experiment almost certainly took place in 1752, though the precise date was never recorded. Franklin conducted it quietly, with only his son William present. The field would have been open and flat, the sky darkening overhead, the kind of afternoon that makes sensible people go indoors. Franklin stood in the shelter of a small shed at the edge of the field, holding the dry silk ribbon tied to the kite string, keeping himself insulated from the charge. William, a young man by this point, held the kite and ran with it until it caught the air and rose. They waited. The string hung slack. Nothing happened. And then the loose threads on the string began to stand up. Franklin brought his knuckle close to the key. A spark jumped. Small, sharp, unmistakable. The clouds above them were electrically charged. Lightning and the spark from his parlor experiments were the same thing. The theory was correct. He did not shout. He did not run through the streets of Philadelphia announcing his discovery. He recorded it, wrote about it carefully, and sent his findings to Peter Collinson in London. The response from the European scientific community was initially skeptical, then astonished, then admiring. The Royal Society, which had earlier declined to publish his electrical papers, now reversed itself and awarded him their highest honor. Universities across Europe gave him honorary degrees. A man who had left school at 10 was now, in the eyes of the learned world, one of the most important scientists alive. But the kite was only the most dramatic moment in a body of work that was genuinely substantial. Franklin had already, before the kite experiment, proposed and begun advocating for the lightning rod, a practical device that used his understanding of electricity to protect buildings and ships from lightning strikes. The idea was simple. A pointed metal rod mounted at the highest point of a structure, connected by a wire to the ground, would attract lightning and conduct its charge safely into the earth, rather than through the building. Before lightning rods, fires caused by lightning strikes were common and devastating. After them, they became much rarer. He also gave the scientific world a language. The terms positive and negative charge, conductor, battery, electrical current, these came from or were shaped by Franklin's work. He thought about electricity in terms of flow, of balance, of excess and deficit, and the vocabulary he developed to describe what he was seeing became the foundation of the field. There is something worth pausing on here. Franklin had no laboratory in any formal sense. He had no university position, no institutional funding, no team of assistants. He had a curious mind, a disciplined habit of observation, and enough material comfort to spend time on questions that had no immediate commercial value. He pursued science the way he pursued everything else in his life. Practically, systematically, and with genuine delight. He enjoyed it. You can feel that enjoyment in the letters he wrote about his experiments. The gentle pleasure of a man who finds the world endlessly interesting and is lucky enough to have the freedom to look at it closely. His reputation now extended well beyond Philadelphia, well beyond the colonies. He was a figure of international standing, and that standing would soon be called into service in ways that had nothing to do with electricity. The relationship between the American colonies and the British government had been growing complicated for years. The colonies were prosperous and increasingly self-aware, developing their own institutions their own civic cultures, their own sense of what they were. Britain, meanwhile, was emerging from a long and expensive war with France, the 7 Years' War, which had resolved the question of which European power would dominate North America in Britain's favour, and was looking to the colonies to help pay for it. The method chosen was taxation. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to pay a tax on paper goods, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards. It was the kind of policy that to many colonists felt like an imposition from a parliament in which they had no representation. Franklin's position in all of this was, for a time, more complicated than it might appear from the distance of history. He had spent years working as an agent for Pennsylvania in London, a kind of unofficial representative, lobbying the British government on the colony's behalf. He was a man who genuinely admired much about British culture and society, who had friends among the English intellectual elite, who had once imagined that the relationship between Britain and its American colonies could be managed, reformed, made more equitable without rupture. He was not, in the early 1760s, a revolutionary. He was a negotiator. He had been living in London for much of the decade, in lodgings on Craven Street near the Thames, in a comfortable house run by a widow named Margaret Stevenson, who became a close friend and something like a second family to him. Her daughter Polly was clever and warm, and Franklin delighted in her company, writing her long letters full of scientific explanations and gentle advice and genuine affection. The Craven Street house was a place of good conversation and regular visitors, and Franklin settled into London life with an ease that surprised even him. The rooms would have been warm in the evenings, firelight on the walls, the sound of the street below, muffled by the heavy curtains that kept out the London damp. He worked at a writing table near the window during the day, conducting his correspondence, drafting documents, meeting with ministers and officials on behalf of his colonial clients. He was known across the city. He was invited to the best tables, included in the most interesting conversations. He was, in a way that he had never quite been even in Philadelphia, at the center of things. But the Stamp Act changed the atmosphere. Colonists at home were furious. There were protests, boycotts, a gathering sense that something had to give. Franklin, in London, initially misjudged the depth of the anger. He thought the act might be modified, softened, made acceptable. He was wrong about that. When he finally understood how completely the colonists rejected the principle, not just the amount of the tax, but the very idea that Parliament could tax them without their consent, he shifted. He appeared before Parliament to argue against the Stamp Act in clear and forceful terms. The Act was repealed in 1766. Franklin took some credit, fairly or not, for that outcome. But the larger problem did not go away. New taxes followed. New resentments followed those. And Franklin, still in London, still hoping for a resolution that would hold the empire together, spent the late 1760s and early 1770s in a position that grew more uncomfortable with each passing year. He was trying to represent the interests of people who were moving toward confrontation, to a government that was moving toward control, and the space between those two directions was narrowing. There came a moment when the tension broke publicly and humiliatingly. In 1773, Franklin had come into possession of a set of private letters written by the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, in which Hutchinson argued for a firmer hand against colonial dissent. Franklin sent the letters to colonial leaders in Boston, believing they would clarify that the harshness of British policy came partly from the advice of the governor himself, rather than from London alone. He hoped it would redirect colonial anger appropriately. Instead, the letters were published. The resulting scandal was enormous, and when it became clear that Franklin had obtained and transmitted the letters, he was summoned to appear before a committee of the Privy Council in January of 1774. What followed was one of the more remarkable scenes of his life. The hearing was held in a room called the Cockpit, a name that carried its own rough history, before a crowd that included many of London's most prominent figures, gathered as much for the spectacle as for the official proceedings. The Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, spent the better part of an hour subjecting Franklin to a ferocious public denunciation. He was called a thief, a man without honor, a schemer who had betrayed private correspondence for political ends. The crowd laughed at the more cutting lines. Franklin stood through all of it without expression, wearing a suit of dark Manchester velvet that witnesses remembered for years afterward. He did not respond. He did not flinch. He simply stood and let the words break around him like water around stone. The following day, he was dismissed from his position as Deputy Postmaster General for the colonies, a post he had held for years and performed with notable efficiency. It was meant to be a humiliation. In some ways it was, but in another way, it clarified something that had perhaps been unclear to him for too long. The possibility of reconciliation, of a negotiated peace between Britain and its American colonies, was not something he could continue to believe in with any honesty. He remained in London for another year, trying still, meeting with various intermediaries and officials who floated various proposals. None of them came to anything. The situation in America was deteriorating. In April of 1775, the first shots of what would become the Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. Franklin was still in London when he heard the news. He boarded a ship and sailed for home. He was 69 years old. The crossing took 6 weeks. He spent much of it at the rail, watching the sea, taking temperature measurements of the water at different depths. He was investigating what he had begun to think of as a river within the ocean, a great current of warm water moving from the Gulf of Mexico toward Europe. He was right about it. The Gulf Stream, which he was among the first to chart systematically, is one of those Franklin achievements that gets lost beneath the more famous ones. A man sailing home to a revolution, still measuring the temperature of the sea, still curious, still unable to stop paying attention to the world. He arrived in Philadelphia in May of 1775 to find a city transformed. The Colonial Congress was meeting. Men were preparing for war. His son William, who had been appointed Royal Governor of New Jersey through Franklin's earlier influence and connections, remained loyal to the British Crown. The fracture between them was quiet at first, then total. Benjamin and William Franklin would never fully reconcile. It was the private wound behind the public story. A father and son standing on opposite sides of a line that neither of them had quite intended to draw, and finding that the line was too deep to cross back over. Franklin threw himself into the work of independence with a kind of focused energy that surprised people who thought of him as an old man. He served on committees. He drafted documents. He offered counsel. When the Continental Congress decided that someone needed to be sent to France to secure French support for the American cause, money, weapons, naval support, the recognition of nations, the choice was almost inevitable. Franklin was the most famous American in the world. He was known and respected in Paris. He understood Europeans. He understood diplomacy. In the autumn of 1776, Benjamin Franklin boarded a ship once more and sailed east across the Atlantic. He was 70 years old. He was suffering from gout, which made walking painful. He had left behind a country at war, a family scattered, a son who had chosen the other side. He sat on the deck in the cold, salt air and watched the American coastline disappear behind him. And whatever he felt in that moment, and we can only imagine, he did not write it down. What lay ahead of him in France would be, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary late acts in the history of public life. But the ship was at sea now, the water dark, and the sky full of stars. And for the moment there was only the crossing, and the cold, and the long, slow miles between one world and the next. Paris received Benjamin Franklin the way cities sometimes receive a person who has already become a legend before he arrives. The newspapers had written about him. The salons had discussed him. His image, the fur cap, the plain coat, the spectacles, had already appeared on engravings sold in Parisian shops. He was, to the French imagination, something almost mythological. The philosopher from the wilderness, the man who had captured lightning, the representative of a new kind of republic, built not on inherited title, but on reason and virtue and the consent of the governed. Franklin understood this. He was too shrewd not to. And he made a quiet, deliberate decision to lean into the image rather than correct it. He wore the fur cap, not because he needed it for warmth, but because it worked. It said, without a word, that he was different from the powdered and brocaded figures of the European courts. It said he came from somewhere real, somewhere unglamorous, somewhere that believed in plain things. The French loved it. They loved him. And Franklin, who had been charming rooms full of people since he was a teenager in his father's Boston kitchen, gave them exactly as much of himself as the situation required, and kept the rest quietly to himself. He settled in a village just outside Paris called Passy, in a house provided by a French admirer named Jacques Donatien, le Rey de Chaumont. The house was comfortable and well situated, with a garden that Franklin made use of whenever his gout allowed him to walk in it. He set up a small printing press. He could not seem to be in any house for long without one, and used it to print personal correspondence, bagatelles, small witty pieces he wrote for his own amusement and for the entertainment of the French friends he gathered around him. And he gathered many. The Paris years were, socially, among the richest of his life. He was welcomed into the great salons of the city, those remarkable institutions of Enlightenment France, where intellectuals, aristocrats, scientists and writers met to talk, really talk, at length, with care, about ideas that mattered. He met Voltaire. The two old men, both giants of their respective worlds, were brought together at a public gathering, and the crowd reportedly insisted they embrace. They did, to considerable applause. It was one of those moments that feels almost too perfectly arranged by history. But it happened. He was particularly close to several remarkable women. French society of the period gave educated, ambitious women more room in public intellectual life than most other European cultures did, and Franklin moved easily and happily in their company. A widow named Anne-Louise Briand de Jouy was a gifted musician and composer who became one of his closest friends in France. They played chess together, corresponded warmly, and their letters have a quality of genuine mutual affection that is touching to read. Another close companion was Madame Helvetius, a widow of a prominent philosopher who presided over one of the most celebrated salons in Paris. Franklin proposed marriage to her. She declined. He wrote her a playful and faintly melancholic little piece, imagining that their deceased spouses had found each other in the afterlife and were getting along very well, and that therefore the two of them might as well console each other in this one. She was charmed. She still declined, but beneath all the dinners and the letters and the chess games and the salon evenings, there was serious work being done. Desperately serious work. The American cause depended on French support in ways that could not be overstated. Without French money, the Continental Army could not be sustained. Without French naval power, Britain's control of the Atlantic coast could not be challenged. Without French recognition of American independence, the new nation would have almost no standing in the eyes of the world. Franklin knew all of this. He worked on it every day, through conversation and correspondence, through patience and the careful cultivation of relationships with the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, who was sympathetic to the American cause, but cautious, always cautious, about the risks of open conflict with Britain. The early months were slow. The French government listened, deliberated, offered some covert assistance, but stopped well short of formal alliance. The situation in America was not encouraging. The Continental Army was struggling. Supplies were short. Morale was fragile. Franklin sent reassuring dispatches home and reassuring words to his French contacts, even when the reality was grim. He was not dishonest, exactly, but he understood that confidence, or at least the appearance of it, was itself a diplomatic instrument. A representative of a failing cause does not attract allies. A representative of a difficult but ultimately winning cause might. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. In October of 1777, the American general Horatio Gates defeated a British force under General Burgoyne at Saratoga in New York. It was a significant victory. The British had lost an entire army in the field. And when the news reached Paris, it changed everything. Vergennes and the French court had been waiting, perhaps without quite admitting it, for evidence that the Americans were capable of winning. Saratoga was that evidence. Negotiations moved quickly after that. In February of 1778, France formally recognized American independence and signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the new nation. It was one of the great diplomatic achievements of the century, and Franklin was at the center of it. He had not done it alone. He had two colleagues, Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, who were officially his co-commissioners, though the relationships among them were difficult and occasionally poisonous, full of suspicion and territorial friction. But Franklin was the face of the mission, the figure the French trusted and admired. and the formal alliance that emerged from those years of quiet work was his in a way that history has rightly recognized. He continued in France for years after the alliance was secured, overseeing the flow of supplies and funds, managing the complicated relationship between the American government and its French patrons, dealing with the endless administrative tangles of wartime diplomacy. He was also, during this period, managing an almost impossible volume of correspondence. Letters came in from across Europe, from America, from scientists and philosophers, and merchants and ordinary people who wanted something or wanted to say something. He answered what he could. He prioritized with the pragmatism that had always characterized him. The war wound toward its conclusion slowly. It ended formally, for diplomatic purposes, in the negotiations that produced the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Franklin was one of the principal American negotiators, alongside John Adams and John Jay. The negotiations were delicate and at times tense. The Americans had to balance their relationship with France, which had its own interest in the outcome, with the need to secure the best possible terms from Britain. Franklin navigated this carefully, contributing to a treaty that gave the United States recognition of its independence, substantial territory east of the Mississippi, fishing rights off Newfoundland, and a framework for the future that was far more favorable than many had thought possible when the war began. He was 77 years old when the treaty was signed. His gout was worse. He had developed a kidney stone that caused him considerable pain when he moved. He wanted to go home. He had been asking permission to return to America for years and had been gently but firmly told each time that he was too important to be spared. Now, finally, there was nothing left that required him in Paris. He said his goodbyes, long, warm, many of them, and in the summer of 1785, he began the journey home. The departure from Passy was emotional in a way that surprised even him. The friends who had gathered around him over 9 years came to see him off. Madame Helvétius wept. The servants wept. Lorée de Chaumont stood in the courtyard of the house and watched the carriages pull away. Franklin rode in a litter provided by the Queen. His back and kidneys made the jolting of a regular carriage difficult to bear, and was carried through the summer countryside of France toward the coast. He was, as he always seemed to be in motion, observing, looking at the light on the fields, thinking about whatever problem his mind had most recently attached itself to. He arrived back in Philadelphia in September of 1785 to a reception that moved him deeply. Cannon were fired. Crowds gathered. Church bells rang across the city. He had been gone 9 years, and the city had changed, and he had changed within it. And the country that had not existed when he left was now a real place, with its own government and its own debates and its own unresolved problems. He was home. He was not done. Within months, he had been elected President of Pennsylvania, the executive position of the state government, and served in that role for 3 years. He continued his scientific correspondence. He wrote. He thought. He had a garden at his Philadelphia house on Market Street, and he spent time in it when he was well enough, sitting in the shade of a mulberry tree he had planted years before, reading or receiving visitors, or simply being still in a way that his life had rarely allowed. He had, in these last years, turned his attention to a cause that had been present in his thinking for a long time, but that he had not, until now, addressed with full directness: the question of slavery. Franklin had owned enslaved people earlier in his life, a fact that sits uncomfortably alongside the image of the champion of liberty, and should. He had moved away from slaveholding over time, and his thinking on the institution had evolved slowly, imperfectly, in the direction of opposition. In the last years of his life, he became president of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery, and he signed a formal petition to Congress in 1790 calling for the end of the slave trade. It was one of the last public acts of his life, and it was not welcomed by the Southern members of Congress, who responded with irritation and arguments that Franklin found morally hollow. He wrote a final satirical piece, one of the last things he published, mocking those arguments by placing them in the mouth of an imaginary North African official, defending the enslavement of Europeans on the same grounds that American slaveholders used to defend their own institution. The parallel was pointed, and the irony was clear. And it was, in its way, a final demonstration of the tool he had been using since he was 16 years old: the invented voice, the sideways approach, the argument made sharper by being made indirectly. He had been doing it since Silence Dogood. He was still doing it at 84. His health was failing through the winter of 1789 and into 1790. The kidney stone was a constant source of pain. He spent more time in bed, in the room on the second floor of the Market Street house, where the light came in through the windows in the afternoon and the sounds of the city drifted up from below. He took laudanum for the pain. He received visitors when he could. He wrote letters still, though his hand was less steady than it had been. John Adams came to see him. Thomas Jefferson, who had followed him as American minister to France and who admired him enormously, corresponded with him until near the end. His daughter Sally, Sarah Bash, who had stayed close to him through the years of his absence and managed the household with warmth and competence, was with him often, along with her children, who were his grandchildren and whom he adored. He had been working on his autobiography for years, beginning it in England in 1771, returning to it in France, adding to it in Philadelphia in his final years. It was addressed, at least in its earliest sections, to his son William, which gives those pages a particular quality now, knowing what the relationship between them became. He wrote about his Boston childhood, his London years, his rise in Philadelphia, with a voice that was candid and reflective, and occasionally self-deprecating, in the particular way that confident people can afford to be. He listed the virtues he had tried to cultivate, 13 of them, including temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, and humility, and admitted with characteristic humor that humility had been the hardest and that he had never fully achieved it, only the appearance of it, which he suspected was perhaps the most anyone could honestly claim. The autobiography was never finished. It breaks off in the middle of a sentence, mid-thought, somewhere in the 1750s of his life, the pen simply stopping. The rest of the story, the electricity, the France years, the treaty, the final decade, was never written down by him. Other people's words have had to carry that part. He died on the evening of April the 17th, 1790. He was 84 years old. He had been largely unconscious for the final days. The breathing slow and difficult. The room quiet. Sally was there. His grandchildren were in the house. The candle on the table beside the bed would have burned low in the night air. The flame small and steady, casting its soft circle of light on the walls, while the city outside moved through its ordinary evening, not yet knowing that something in it had ended. The news spread quickly. Philadelphia went into mourning. Flags were lowered. 20,000 people attended his funeral, an extraordinary number for a city of that size at that time, perhaps a fifth of the entire population of Philadelphia, turning out in the streets to watch the procession pass. The French National Assembly, in the middle of its own revolution, declared 3 days of mourning. Letters of condolence came from across the world. He was buried in Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia, beside Deborah, who had died 16 years before him. The gravestone they share is simple, as he had requested. Just names, just dates. The plain marker of a man who spent a lifetime believing that what you did mattered more than what you called yourself. What he did, in the end, was almost too much to hold in a single life. Printer, writer, postmaster, inventor, scientist, diplomat, statesman, founder. He was the only person to sign all 4 of the major documents of American founding: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. He invented the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, the flexible urinary catheter, the Franklin stove. He charted the Gulf Stream. He established the first lending library in America, one of its first fire companies, one of its first hospitals, one of its first universities. He corresponded with the greatest minds of 2 continents and was recognized by them as an equal. And he had left school at 10. There is something in that fact that has never entirely left me. Not because formal education is unimportant, it is not, but because of what it suggests about the other ways a mind can grow. He grew through reading, through conversation, through the junto and the print shop, and the long nights of experiment, and the decades of correspondence. He grew through failure and embarrassment, and the humiliation of the cockpit, and the slow dissolution of his relationship with his son. He grew through the quiet discipline of trying, every year, to be slightly more honest, slightly more useful, slightly more humble than he had been the year before. He knew he had not always succeeded. He said so, in various ways, throughout his life. He had been proud when he should have been patient. He had been absent when he should have been present. He had held positions too long, changed them too slowly, arrived at moral clarity on the question of slavery far later than the clarity required. He was not a saint. He was not a myth. He was a person who lived a very long life and paid attention to most of it, and who left the world measurably different from how he found it. The lightning rod stands on buildings still. The libraries he believed in are still open. The country he helped bring into being is still here, still working through the arguments he and his colleagues left unresolved, still trying to figure out what it means to build a society on the idea that all people are created equal, an idea that his own life honored only imperfectly, as he knew, but that he believed in enough to keep reaching toward, even at the end. The mulberry tree in his garden in Philadelphia is gone now. The Market Street house is gone. The Craven Street house in London still stands and has been preserved, and you can walk through the rooms where he worked and talked and argued and rested on winter evenings with the fire going and the Thames a short walk away in the dark. The rooms are quiet. The furniture is period appropriate. The light comes in through the old windows in the same angles it always did. Standing there, it is possible to feel something of what the place must have been. The papers on the table, the candles in the evening, the sound of carriages in the street below, and a man at his desk, writing, thinking, paying attention to the world for one more hour. He asked, in his will, that his epitaph be simple. He had written a fanciful version of it as a young man, the famous one, comparing himself to a book whose revised edition would appear more elegant than the first, a printer's joke about resurrection. But the stone that marks his grave says only what needs to be said. Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. The date. Nothing more. The rest is in the record. The letters. The invention. The institutions. The Constitution. The lending library. And the lightning rod. And the long, patient, imperfect, extraordinary life of a candlemaker's son from Boston who wanted to understand how things worked and never quite stopped wanting that. Not even at the end. Not even when understanding cost him something. Not even when the world gave him every reason to rest. He rested eventually, as we all do. As you might now, if the hour is late and the room is quiet and the story has carried you as far as stories can. If there is another life you would like to hear told in this quiet way, you are welcome to leave the name below. These stories will be here whenever you need them. For now, let the candle burn low. Let the night do what the night is for. Sleep well.